Ladies and gentlemen, at Gass-Donnelly. Und Angelina Maccarone. Und wir gehen dann nach vorne, dann ist es etwas familiärer, vor allem auch um die Uhrzeit.
Soll ich das nehmen? Oder?
Ja, wir schauen mal. Nur vorneweg, wir sind extrem glücklich, dass was passiert ist, was eigentlich ständig passieren soll, nämlich genau 14 Mal. Dieser Film hat auch mit durch uns einen Verleih gefunden, nämlich Cine Global, der Verleih, der Vertrieb, der auch den Eröffnungsfilm rausbringen wird, nächste Woche am 8. bei der Triste de Trompeta, Mad Circus, und diesen Small Town Murder Songs am 15. März. Und Daniel O'Doherty ist da und ja, einer der letzten Mohikaner in diesem Business. Danke dir.
Yeah, I talked about the contrasts before the film, and now it seemed to me that on a superficial level there are these contrasts, like there's good, there's evil, there's violence, there's this pacifist community, there's innocence and there's guilt. But then I saw the film 3 times now, and now the third time I thought, no, there's not so much contrast there, because everything is inside of this main character, the Walter figure. And I was just wondering, because he is a man who has beaten first, and then he is beaten up by the guy. But it always takes somebody who beats to make a martyr, in a way. So I was wondering about your attitude towards these opposites, and also about violence and the idea of justice. Could you talk about this a little?
Yeah, I mean, I guess fundamentally, I think I'll try and speak slow. I've been drinking, so I will speak faster. But I will try and speak slowly and eloquently. I am always fascinated, I think, by the contradictions in human beings. Somebody asked me earlier, had I thought of Peter from the beginning as the actor to play that role? And I said, no, actually. I've found that my initial sometimes gut impulses, often because I write my own material, but probably even if I didn't, my gut impulses for the first person that comes into my mind as an actor is always the wrong person, because they are the archetype. It would be like, the first person that I thought of was actually Chris Cooper. So I'm thinking, or somebody like, I'm blanking on his name, from No Country for Old Men, like somebody like, there's an obvious archetype of that character, but if I were to cast somebody like that in this film, because what I'm responding to is like, my mind instantly goes to what have I seen before? And then if I just to give you exactly what I've seen, I've seen before, there's no contradiction, there's no conflict. It's just giving you you know what you're gonna, you know what to expect, and you know what you're gonna get. But I always find that there's something much more interesting about finding then the impulses of a character, of an archetype, like say Josh Brolin, say in No Country for Old Men, and trying to internalize that into a very different man, somebody like Peter Stormare. So for me, I really love the idea too of a man like Peter, just speaking of contradictions, a man who is known, I mean, his resume as an actor, I think, is he's trying to live down his reputation of playing violent characters and trying to do something different. And now he's playing a man who's trying to live down his violent past. I think there's an inherent sort of parallel going on between between both the character and the actor, and I think that's actually for me more exciting, because when you see him on screen, part of you can't help but I think see, if you recognize him, as the guy stuffing Steve Buscemi in a wood chipper in Fargo. So part of you assumes he's a bad man because there's something about, he's got a slightly bent nose, and so I'm always much more interested in trying to take a character like that and then find the yin and the yang. It is then trying to find he obviously has violent impulses, but he's also trying to be a different man, and what is that struggle like? Is change possible? Like, those are all kind of, for me, the questions that I'm fascinated by. And I guess I wasn't conscious of it when I wrote the movie, but the first question I got asked when the movie premiered was, what inspired the movie? And honestly, I'd already done a bunch of interviews at the time, but I was just like, oh, well, 2 people were shot to death on my street a few months before I started writing it. And I wasn't consciously writing about that, but I think I can't not acknowledge the fact that subconsciously because I live in a very sort of friendly, safe part of Toronto, the part of me was definitely going to be writing about the loss of innocence of a neighborhood and trying to, like, what is it to have, like, violence in a small community like that. So I think I started wanting to write that, and the very original idea was just, you know, exploring the ripple effects of a community, of a murder in a community that hasn't had a murder in 50 years, and what is it then to, as well, you know, be a man with a history of violence in a community like that, and have this community not forgive you. So I mean, I guess I'm kind of rambling in a way, because there's just so many. I'm so much interested just in contradiction and in the complexity of those kind of thoughts. As somebody who can be both a pacifist and a police officer, and someone who could have beaten somebody potentially to death, we don't know, and at the same time be trying to prove that he's different. And I guess fundamentally what interests me in religion, because, you know, I'm not religious myself, but it does play a role in a couple of my films, because fundamentally it represents for me the conflict between what we feel we intellectually should be and what sometimes our animal instinct drives us towards, and how do we find a balance between that. And I think that for me is the struggle between him. On the one hand, he wants to be a nobler, better, you know, more devout religious man, or the man he believes he was brought up to be, but at the same time, like, he's got a temper and he has anger, and you can't deny that is sometimes a part of who we are as human beings. So I think that there is a fundamental, often, imbalance between, and probably why there's a lot of problems in the world, between our gut impulses and the way we're led to believe we should be.
Yeah, no, you answered basically all of my questions.
Oh. Great, okay,
no,
see you guys.
No. But I would like to come back to the question of violence, because I think it's very interesting that even though Walter doesn't want to be a violent man, he kind of triggers the violence by going there and by provoking Steve. Mm-hmm. So does that make him a better person?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's funny. I once did an interview with, I can't remember if it was an interview. No, it was a Q&A, and one person in the audience, I know they were leading me to say something that I wasn't going to, and because they were a professor of the Mennonite, they were a university professor specializing in the Mennonite religion, and they were trying to lead me down a path to make me say, like, well, and therefore the Mennonite faith doesn't work, because they're suggesting that pacifism doesn't work. And anyway, it does get complicated.
I'm not trying to make
no. It's just, it's fine. I didn't suggest you were. It's just for me. It opened my eyes that there's a lot of just different and interesting responses to that question. And I guess, is it that Walter, and because I truly believe sometimes that what was in my mind doesn't matter so much as what's on the screen, because you can only, I try to be sparse, I don't give too many answers. So did he go to Steve's knowing definitively what would happen, or was it a moment made in, like, was he rewarded for, you know, if he had, because he gets to the point where he could kill him, you know, I think that in many ways for me, like, that's, if he'd followed through on that, would Rita have, you know, would the ending, would he have found out that Steve was the killer? Or in some ways there was, like, I liked the idea that even though I'm not religious, that somehow I was karmically rewarding him for staying to the path, not a religious path, but the path that he as an individual was trying to follow. So that at the end of the day, even though he came to violence, but he didn't, even though he started it, he didn't follow through on like, he had the choice to, like, kill him, but didn't. And that for me is why, even though he's going to lose his job as a cop, you can assume that his career is going to go badly for him after the movie ends, but fundamentally he at least was able to control himself within along the path that he had hoped to set out for himself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, since you don't want to answer the question what your personal attitude is towards this, but there's another interesting aspect, like the mother in the backseat. She talks about justice and that the law doesn't really pay justice to what happened to her daughter. So it's also about that Walter kind of, or where does this impulse of violence come from?
Well, definitely, yeah. I mean, I think I think that's what kind of drives him. He can, on the one hand, because I don't think necessarily the violent impulses of human beings are just random. I mean, you can feel that somebody deserves to be, to be punished, and to feel angry about that, and but I think I'm always much more interested in movies that, again, can pose a question as opposed to definitively deliver an opinion or an answer. And I would much rather people leave a cinema asking that question amongst themselves. But for me, fundamentally, within a justice system, like what is, it is a question that I don't think I can answer. I can only ask the question, like, what is real justice? I think in the end, in this movie, there is a justice in that Walter doesn't have to do something horrible per se and still manages to, and justice prevails in a way. Like Steve is arrested, but I think because for me, I guess the movie, I never saw the movie so much as about catching a killer so much as about like an internal struggle about a man trying to change and the forces at work that are pushing him in different directions. And on the one hand, he is trying to say no, like, I will deny the natural impulses I have, but then a scene like that where the woman is saying there is no such thing as justice, how can your logical, ideological system or police system bring justice? There is no justice. He's going to get like 6 months or a year and then be back on the streets, and yet my daughter's dead. Like, is that fair? Is it not more fair to maybe kill him too? And I don't know. I think that's a question that you can only ever debate. Like, I don't think you can definitively answer that. I think that's an ongoing, and that's why I don't choose to. I'm interested in the discussion, but not offering an answer because I don't have one as a human. Like, it would be to say, no, definitively death penalty is completely wrong. Well, I largely believe that, but then you hear about these horrible things of like people killing people and doing all these horrible things to people, and yet they're released onto the streets a year later. Is that justice too? So conversely, what's more fair? Like, killing a criminal or letting them free after you? I just don't. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't have to answer this.
Yeah.
But do you have any questions I want to open? Yes, please.
Why did you include that scene of the house being moved to the hamlet? What's the role of that scene? Must have been quite a mess to organize it.
Yeah, it's funny. That was one of the scenes that I ended up having to fight hardest for, and actually, frankly, it was one of the ones I stand by the most. Was I really felt, my producing partner. I produced this with one of my close friends, and he was like, "Look, God, man, it's going to cost so much money to do this," and I was like, frankly, if we don't have that scene, the beginning of the movie will be a movie of the week. Like, it'll be a television movie. Like, there's nothing. It'll start saying that this is a regular sort of cop procedural drama, and that for me was fundamentally not the movie I'm trying to make. Which I felt if that is the I really believe that movies make a promise in the first 10 minutes, and they can, you can manipulate the audience in one way. But if you say definitively you are one thing and then you don't deliver that, you have to do that intentionally. So for me, if I did that, I really feel that I would have been saying this is a really complex CSI episode or whodunit, and that was never the movie I wanted to make. So, but what I did on an emotional level, there was a symbol to me of a man sort of like moving a heavy weight and as well sort of being the cock of the walk within this community, despite the fact that it seems like a meager job. But at the same time, it also sets us very much into the pace and world of a town and life that is not... certainly not typical of this genre, I think, of a cop genre in movies, but also it's just not typical of an urban environment. Like, we would be cutting a lot, and I really believe that there's actually tension to be, you can create tension very much in holding on to a more nostalgic approach to cinema in terms of using master shots, and not to say that I would make all my movies that way. My first movie is completely different, but this was very much a movie that I wanted to use that aesthetic. So that scene, above all else, was the one that would define aesthetically, whether you're aware of it or not, in my opinion at least, the kind of movie you're seeing. And if it was not there, as it was, because I played with it a lot of times, and the key for making it work, in my opinion, was finding the right music to match it. Because when it was with the wrong music, it just wasn't making sense to me. But with the music that we have, I believe it does. Anyway, that's a long-winded answer, but that's my answer.
Just one short question about the music, because I think the rhythm of the film is very important. You use slow motion and then the music takes over, which is very unusual. This is why I made this bad joke about the music before the film, because the music really takes over and you don't really hear anything else but the music, and then you have the slow motion and then you have intercut the flashback. Could you tell a little bit about how you came about the rhythm of the film?
Well, when I sat down to make the movie, I was originally thinking I was going to make a sort of much smaller, artier film. I mean, the original idea was that it wasn't even going to be one main character. It was going to be just focusing on a bunch of supporting characters, and it was going to be a bit more sort of a Jim Jarmusch kind of like scenes that had like marked blackouts between them, and then punctuated by specific songs. That was my initial thought when I started writing, and obviously things evolve. But I was from the beginning though wanting to write the whole movie around a very specific album and of music. And once I got into post-production, I actually entirely abandoned the score that I had written the movie around, and the reason being was, in the same way that I feel like casting the actor that is your initial impulse and then putting that in the movie, there's no conflict. You would just be painting everything the obvious color. And I really felt that the music had influenced the style of the movie to have this like gentle pace, and that to put that gentle music back up against these gentle images would frankly be boring. And like it would all be saying the same thing. There was no conflict. Every piece of the puzzle was painted the same color. So I really it was a very hard decision to make, because you're abandoning the very thing that inspired you. But I felt like the music that inspired me had already done its work from an inspiration point of view, and now I needed to move on to something that had a lot more sense of just building conflict and really helping create the religious arc of the film without ever the characters almost never talk about religion, but we feel its weight throughout the whole film, I think. And so that for me was, but that said, from the very beginning, there were always these kind of like montage sort of segments written in where I just felt that the music was always going to be a character in the movie. I think I just didn't know at the time exactly the texture of who the character was until I got into post-production on the movie.
Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the music as well. Could you just tell us briefly what the music was? I think there was some choral music in there, and also perhaps tell us what is the music in the title, the murder songs. What is that? And my other question is about the access that you had or perhaps didn't have to the Mennonite community. Did you have some connection there?
Yeah, I mean, first thing first, I mean, the music is almost all of it, except for one song, is from this one local, actually Toronto-based band called Bruce Peninsula. Now, they've got very rich sort of, I'm trying to blank on the name of it now, the song actually, When the House Moves, is a traditional, I'm just completely blanking on it. Sorry? No, sorry, not that no, there are traditional songs, but it's a very specific style of almost not a throat singing, it's killing me, it's such a specific name, but I'm forgetting what it is actually, but the band was influenced by the name of that specific music, and as soon as I answer the question, I'm going to remember it, and I'll just yell it. But it's not a word I use on a regular basis because it is very specific. But so that band was just this. They definitely had like a sort of strong sort of rootsy gospel element. The band actually is a lot more electric, like in terms of a lot more electric instruments than I use. So I focused on. Like some people have asked me, is there a native influence to the music? And I think it's because I tended to focus within the palette of much more vocals and drumming, which I can understand the correlation, even though it's not entirely correct. But so I was like, often when I was working with the musicians, I'd be like, okay, take out the cowbell, take out the electric guitar, just like stripping it down to much more sort of primal, basic musical elements. I felt like chanting and pounding. And so if you were to go and listen to their other music, it doesn't all sound quite like that, but I cherry-picked the songs that fit the palette I was trying to create. Although I'm now forgetting. Oh, right, the Mennonites. And yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of Mennonites in Canada. Two close friends of mine grew up in a much more progressive Mennonite community. It wasn't what was depicted here. I mean, the community I depicted there is very realistic, and a couple of the guys in it are actually Mennonite from a more old school upbringing, but it was just, honestly, it was funny. I was shooting in a very specific area where there are a lot of Mennonites, and I really wanted to be authentic, but I didn't really have the time to like go door to door and get them to be in the movie, so I ended up like shipping in I called like Rent a Mennonite, and brought in a bunch of Mennonites from another town like 6 hours away, which is where my friends are from. And so it's all of their like extended family. Anybody who speaks Plattdeutsch in the film, which is the Lower German Dutch hybrid, is that they grew up from that community. the geography was much more exciting where we filmed it compared to where all these guys were from, and where they were from was also farther away from just with the driving and stuff. So it was kind of funny to actually go all the way to film in a very specific area, and then the only people in it are actually from a completely different area. But that's the magic and lie of cinema.
Which one was the area?
It's actually they were from Leamington, Ontario, but we ended up filming in Listowel, Ontario, which is near Waterloo. And if anybody knows Ontario geography, there's a huge number of Mennonites in that area, and like a bunch of Mennonite universities, and this was a small town about 40 minutes west of there.
Didn't you ask about the title as well?
Oh, and the title. The title is a bit of an homage to the original title of the album. I mean, the original album I based it on was called Small Town Murder Scenes, or Small Town Murder Scene, and I was trying to do a double entendre of being the sort of like formal scene structure to the film, and then playing on the idea of like scenes in a movie, but also then like murder scenes. But as I changed the music, I really felt that music. I liked the idea of like setting, frankly, both like the almost like a game of Clue, the geography, the fact that there's murder, and also, but that music would play it wasn't illogical in terms of from a plot point of view, but for me it was more setting the sort of tone, and again, for me it's like, what is the promise you're making to the audience, and the way that they're like music and murder and small town, like those are all very much of the film, and that there's it's going to frankly be a little bit arty, but at the same time have a criminal element. I don't know, it was more of just a gut thing as opposed to anything else. It wasn't as I tried to think. We thought out a lot of different logical titles that I hated, and this was one of the first titles I came to. My producing partner shot it down, and then like a month after my deadline, when I was supposed to have locked the title, eventually was like, "So what do you guys think about Small Town Murder Songs?" And the guy doing the titles in the edit studio was like, "I think that's a good title." I was like, "He fucking thinks it's a good title. Let's pick that as the title." And so we did.
I had the impression that there was had he sort of turned his back on the Mennonite community or something, because there like some kind of tension with his father, and how does, I guess a sort of pious Mennonite wouldn't be cohabiting with a woman unmarried and so on.
I mean, the essence, and again, like, I intentionally, because again, I'm so like sensitive in movies like this to offer too much exposition, so I've always tried to find the balance between letting you walk into a community and like letting it feel real and letting it exist, and hopefully guiding you to get a sense of it without having to verbally explain it. But I mean, for me, it was basically what you're saying, but slightly the converse, that he was shunned from the community as opposed to him shunning, which is a very much, shunning, it does become a part of that faith, that you can be offered opportunities to change, but after a certain point, if you don't, they don't believe in violence and aggression, but at the same time, they do believe in passive aggression, which would be, we're not going to, a little bit like, say, like a Breaking the Waves or something like that, which was similar. I don't know what religious community that was, but the whole idea that she was shunned, more extremely done in that film, but it is a real. He just became ostracized. Like you're right. Because there is no. He does become baptized, but that also becomes like a choice to try and, for me, again, like, without trying to say definitive, I'm always trying to preface anything without, because what I think, it doesn't actually really matter in some ways, but for me, at least my intention is that is him making efforts to work his way back. He's a man who's been shunned and is trying to work his way back. He's trying to live a pious life, having lived an unpious one, or has, at least, if nothing else, has regrets that he's trying to make amends for.
Any more questions? Okay, just maybe one last about the headings of the chapters. How did you find them?
Honestly, it was mostly the internet. I felt the urge to do it, but I didn't, at the time, I hadn't quite figured out. It was part of the post-production process because, again, there were other scenes that I removed from the film that were more, a bit more expositional from a religious perspective. And I just didn't really want to talk that much about it, but I always wanted to create the feeling that there was a power bigger than him at work, and that he was, that somehow, and there was always for me an intentional relationship between sort of like, man and nature and or God. I've seen that. That was very much why there was always these like giant shots within like a small piece of technology, sort of moving through it, or man being small compared to this vast space, And so the titles became for me an extension of that, and they're all elements of. Several of them are either based on tenets that are the basis of the Mennonite faith, or like one of them was just from a specific deacon's. They don't call it a sermon, but I'm forgetting the word. But like like a church speech that was written. But the one was God meets you where you're at. That was that embodied the spirit of the faith, without being actually a direct biblical quote. But several of the others were biblical quotes that are definitely based on certainly the ideas of pacifism, and I'm trying to remember actually what all of them are. But they were all related very specifically to the Mennonite faith. And that said, I was also trying to sculpt them in a way that informed or led you to believe that somehow that would influence the way you should interpret the scene, either just seen or that would come, in terms of whether it's creating a sense of potential violence, like turning the other cheek, or something like God meets you at, which it's a very vague. I mean, on the one hand, you can interpret that a lot of different ways. I mean, for me, it was the idea that what I liked, that you don't have to be following a perfect path. You just, in terms of like, going to church every single day, you just have to be open yourself to it. So that, just trying to inform where he was at in his particular journey.
Okay, so we call it a day. Thank you.
Thank you very much for staying.